And we're live. Take it away, Edgar.
Hi, welcome. My name is Edgar Villanueva. I'm an enrolled member of the Lumbee Tribe in North Carolina, and I'm also the Vice President of Programs and Advocacy at the Schott Foundation for Public Education. The Schott Foundation is a national philanthropic organization that focuses on educational opportunity, healthy living and learning communities, and community-led change. For more than 25 years, we have been accelerating advocacy by supporting local, statewide, and national campaigns that are working to close the opportunity gap for low-income and youth of color in the United States. As an intermediary, Schott works to leverage philanthropic dollars to support policy advocacy strategies that both acknowledge and address intersectional issues for youth of color. We bring researchers and advocates together to strategize for change, and we employ a variety of strategies to communicate and spotlight issues and solutions in philanthropy. The Schott Foundation, in partnership with Native Americans in Philanthropy and the Nike N7 Fund, recently released a set of recommendations for philanthropy for helping Native youth live healthy lives. These recommendations came directly from Native American leaders who hold expertise across health, physical fitness, education, and youth development sectors. The report, which you can find on our website, is called Original Instructions. It outlines both challenges and opportunities to philanthropy. It's the first step toward using our resources to recognize and to learn from resilient Native youth. As a Native American funder and chair of the board of directors of Native American Philanthropy, I join you all today as an intent listener and a learner to gain new insights from our expert panel of presenters on ways in which we can actively work towards solutions to support Native youth. To help facilitate your engagement through this webinar, we ask that you use the chat function in your box to post questions. We will reserve time at the end of our conversation today for you all to ask questions from the panelists, and we will respond to as many questions as possible. We also encourage you to tweet your thoughts and your questions to the Schott Foundation Twitter handle at Schott, SCHOTT, found, using the hashtag grassrootsed. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Today, we're gonna have Sarah Eaglehart, who is CEO of Native Americans in Philanthropy. We also have Eric Stegman, who is Executive Director of the Center for Native American Youth at the Aspen Institute, and Dr. Michael Yellowbird, who is Director of Tribal and Indigenous People Studies at the North Dakota State University. So thank you guys. We really appreciate you taking the time today to share your expertise with us. By way of introduction, Eric, we'll start with you. If you could just take a few minutes to tell us a little bit about the Center for Native American Youth and the work you guys are doing to support our young people.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Edgar, for inviting me to be part of this panel today. My name's Eric Stegman, and I run the Center for Native American Youth at the Aspen Institute. My family's from the Carry the Kettle Nakota First Nation up in Saskatchewan. And I've been here at the center for about 2.5 years now. And we're a policy and advocacy program at the Aspen Institute and really serve as a national platform for Native youth to connect with one another as advocates, but also really help connect movements and really serve as a coordinator among a lot of our other tribal partner organizations for Native youth. The cornerstone of our work is really direct engagement with Native youth. So we spend a lot of time on the ground in communities meeting face-to-face with Native youth, with service providers and tribal leaders who've made Native youth a priority. And we find as many opportunities as possible to really pull chairs up to as many tables as we can find where Native youth don't have a voice and should have a Native voice. One of our biggest efforts in this area to really help lift up Native youth priorities is our annual State of Native Youth report, which is available at our website at cnay.org. And in that report, we really try to help the rest of our partners understand really what's happening out on the ground with Native youth, both the issues that they care about, the current research and data about their lives, and really lift up the kinds of programs and movements that Native youth are engaged in to really change the issues that matter to them. We also have a policy and research area of our work where we find opportunities being based in Washington, D.C. to bring Native youth to speak in their own voice to policymakers and staff and other experts. And then we also do a lot of work with the media. We really believe that Native youth are on the leading edge of helping change the narrative about Indian country from a deficit one that focuses on deficits to one that really focuses on strengths. So we really find as many opportunities as we can in the media, at conferences, and any other number of platforms to really help Native youth lead with the solutions that they're leading in their communities and not just the challenges. So that's kind of a quick rundown of our work.
Thank you, Eric. And welcome, Dr. Michael Yellowbird. We're opening with a question. If you could just take a couple of minutes to tell us a little bit about your organization or your work and its impact on Native youth.
Yeah, so hello, hello everyone. A lot of the work that I do today focuses specifically on Native youth with regard to mindfulness and what I call neurodecolonization. I use a lot of I visit a lot of communities. I've done some research in Northern California with Yurok students at their school. And I'm currently doing a project on the Ojibwe reservation at the Circle of Life Academy. And a lot of the stuff that I do now today is a response to historical trauma and teaching young people and their teachers and their parents about the importance of things like neuroplasticity. Can you hear me okay? Okay, so I spend a lot of time talking with folks, a lot about basic neurosciences and a lot of the important things with regard to the brain. And then I do a lot of sharing with them about a lot of the cultural traditions as well as ceremonies, as well as how people lived, and to draw some really interesting parallels with some of that work that's being done on brain research and some of the contemplative practices that Native people used to do. And then I spend a lot of time introducing youth into those practices. At some point during the practice, they get a chance to see the really strong connections between their cultural way of life and the current neuroscience in terms of the neurobiology of the brain and how the brain works, and how doing that kind of positivity in regard to some of the practices they do lead to some pretty dramatic changes in the brain, as well as in emotional regulation and a number of other areas.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Yellowbird. And Sarah, most of our participants probably familiar with NAP, but if you can just talk a little bit about who NAP is and what NAP is doing to support Native youth in this moment.
Sure. So I'm Betty Watchday. Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Good morning, everybody. I'm really excited to be here with you today. And, our work at Native Americans in Philanthropy is really to educate, engage, and empower. And we do that in a variety of ways. We work with amazing foundations around their strategic planning and giving. And so we actually advise a couple foundations with a couple different projects, the Gen Indigenous Fund, as well as the Native Voices Rising Fund. And then we also work on research. So we work with amazing people like Dr. Yellowbird to develop research and work with foundations to do the same. And then we work with our nonprofits around different advocacy campaigns. So that's just a little peek into what we do. And I'll just stop there because I think we'll have a lot more to share a little bit down the road. Edgar, you're on mute.
Thank you. I want to remind everyone to put questions that may come up for you during the conversation in the chat box on your screen. We will stop at about at least a quarter till the top of the hour to entertain questions from our participants. And you may also tweet questions to us at Schott Found using the hashtag GrassrootsEd. When we all talked, when many of us spoke about this issue at a funders briefing last summer, We were in DC and we had a conversation around what is most at risk right now for Native youth post Standing Rock, and in light of what's going on with the current administration. Could you guys, share with us what you're hearing from Native youth or what you're seeing in the work in terms of what is most at risk right now for our young people? Eric, do you want to start with that?
Sure. Can you hear me better now? Okay, great. Yeah, I think there's a lot that's at risk in certain ways. Obviously, any of the potential budget cuts that we've seen proposed out there have a number of different kinds of impacts across issues that matter to Native youth. But for us, we've really been doing our best to try to keep a finger on the pulse of all the different movements that have really exploded, particularly in the wake of Standing Rock and the President Obama's Generation Indigenous Initiative. I see a lot of work going on right now, particularly at the local level, on some of those key priorities that a lot of Native youth across the country share, particularly around sacred sites and waterways, culture revitalization, and a number of other issues. And they're really identifying ways to start engaging with local policymakers and others where, they don't see a lot of traction happening at the national level. So I think a lot of where I see the potential impact to be able to push back on any issues that are challenging Native youth is really going to be coming out of this new organizing infrastructure that they're really creating on the ground across the country themselves.
Absolutely. Sarah, Dr. Yellowbird, anything you want to add? What's really most at risk right now for our Native youth that we need to understand?
I can jump in, and then maybe Dr. Yellowbird could go a little bit more, I think, local. From what I see in my perspective, I just think that we're at a really critical time for Native American youth. I believe that, Standing Rock really woke up our youth and our community in a lot of ways that we knew and we expected, but at the same time, it seems just so much more critical because our youth are completely engaged right now. And so they're engaged and they're paying attention. And I think at the same time, you see Philanthropy with their different funding streams, whether it's men and boys or women and girls, Indigenous peoples and Native youth really needing to be a part of those funding streams, especially now. And so I think that as Philanthropy continues to gain knowledge about where our Native American youth are today and the context of our struggles, with whatever it is, the issues relating to poverty or the horrific health statistics, but also like how to work with our community through advocacy and through organizing. It's been a really exciting time, but I think it's also been a really critical time for Native youth organizations like Eric's, like Unity, to come together and to strategize and to think about what are the priorities for our Native youth during this really critical time. And then Philanthropy, there's just a lot to learn. Philanthropy, I think, just through research, that we see out there, and just through the knowledge and conversations that we've had with different CEOs and foundation staff, there's really a desire to learn. But yet we know that because of history, because Native American history has not been included in school books, if you're in college, you have to learn it, you have to be intentional about learning this history. It's just a fact that foundation staff have a long way to catch up to understanding the context of our communities. So there's this urgent need and this urgent time, but at the same time, we need foundations to step in just as urgently into learning about our history and our context. So I just think it's at a really, really critical tipping point for our community.
Absolutely. Dr. Yellowbird, anything you want to add to that question?
Sure. I think, it's a really important question, being at risk, what does at risk mean, And I think some of the things that all the other speakers are talking about, I think are very critical. I think there really needs to be an infrastructure built for youth and really in many ways managed by tribal youth. There's a lot of really up and coming, young, bright, very bright people that are doing a lot of great work, and through these different agencies. I see that, and I see that a lot of times in the social media. I run across students all the time. So I think, there are folks that are really keeping their finger on the pulse of what's going on in their own communities and with Native youth generally across the country and around the world, really. So some things I think what they're at risk for is I always like to think about, like, what does the next generation look like? The next generation that's going to assume the leadership positions and really those kinds of things. And I had a chance to share with my students this morning some of the things that were happening in the 70s with the American Indian movement and the trail of broken treaties and all the different kinds of things that were happening. And I think questions that someone like Lehman Brightman, who people may or may not know, was very instrumental in the 70s movement, was asking, and these questions: what are the next group of young people going to look like? How are they going to be ready to take on this really difficult task of, balancing our sovereignty with our integration into mainstream society, as well as hanging on to culture. So that's what I think about. What does the next generation look like? What assets do they have? And I think there's a lot of assets people have. There's a lot of good leadership in the community. And there are also a lot of challenges, too, where a lot of Native youth are themselves are not connected to some of these systems as well, that may be on reservations or places. So I think that's a really big part of it, is that there really has to be a much bigger recruitment of Native youth to be brought in to address some of the issues. Because there are people that are doing things that are not necessarily part of the infrastructure of the youth organizations now that could be brought in, that are doing a lot of independent work, especially around health. Really good stuff is going on with health. People are doing a lot of stuff around food sovereignty, that sort of thing. And a lot of people are really asking this serious questions about how do we deal with suicide. And advocacy is huge. I think it's huge. There needs to be a lot of advocacy pushed forward, and I think groups of philanthropy can really help build that infrastructure so that Native youth are not absent from the narrative of other American youth. So that's really huge.
Absolutely. So Sarah alluded to the need for additional investment in Native communities. We know that the Native American population is about 2% of the population, yet we receive less than 0.3% of philanthropic dollars. So especially Eric and Dr. Yellowbird, those of you who are outside of this space on a daily basis, what do you think some of the barriers are for, connecting our communities with philanthropy? Like, why are we not seeing the investment from philanthropy that we need to see? Or what experience might you have working with philanthropy?
Well, one of the things I can say is that, there's a great deal of diversity among Native people in the United States. So when philanthropy maybe provides some kind of support for Native youth, maybe providing support for a particular region or a particular part of the, Native American demographic. But, there's a lot of tribes, right? There's over 560 tribes in the United States and more that are still petitioning for federal recognition. So I think that's one thing, is that I think it's really important that, we have a much clearer sort of infrastructure or strategic plan on how to, fund these different sectors that exist, in the United States and Alaska as well. But I think that's the huge thing, is first of all, kind of know the terrain. And I think people just don't really know the terrain. The other thing I'll say I think that's really important is that Native youth have been so absent from the narrative. And I think, I know leadership programs are being developed for them, but I mean, it's very rarely you see them on, major networks or, shows or programming and that kind of thing, so that they can talk about, some of the issues that they're dealing with. So I think that's just that they're just very absent from the narrative and they're sort of off the radar. So that really has to change a lot. And in order for that to change, people have to know the terrain. They have to know these different, the diversity of the groups. So.
Yeah, this is Eric, and I want to kind of build off of Dr. Yellowbird's point on being absent in the narrative. I think there's a huge challenge for Native youth advocates across the country and having to do what a lot of us have to do in Indian country, working on the issues that we do. And it is a lot of that primary education about our communities. And so, you know, Native youth are working on a lot of really critical, fast-moving issues, but oftentimes have to explain to a lot of people what, you know, our tribal communities mean, the diversity, everything that Dr. Yellowbird said. I think that there's a few key challenges as that sort of relates to philanthropy. I think one, philanthropy just needs to be doing even more investment in youth work, period. You know, I was just at the March for Our Lives in Washington, D.C. This weekend, and I was absolutely blown away at the number of youth leaders from all over the country who were there, who were really, really changing the conversation around one big issue. And we've seen the same thing with Standing Rock and Black Lives Matter and a number of other things. If we're really going to give them the platforms and the tools that they need to take that from a conversation changer to a policy changer, we need a lot more resources, particularly when you're looking at things like grassroots organizing. And then the second thing that I'd say about it that I've really noticed in my conversations with a lot of the philanthropic community is a lot of times philanthropy is investing in, you know, what you largely call systems change movement, really looking at how do we try to change these systems like foster care and juvenile justice that are really creating barriers to opportunity. And Native youth are some of the highest serving in those systems, but the opportunities to advocate are usually siloed by tribal community, by culture, by ethnicity. And I think a lot of times philanthropy isn't looking at the broader picture of, you know, if we have to change these large systems in the country, how do we really invest in opportunities for all of the different communities who are impacted to really build their voice together to change those systems? Because I think too often philanthropy will look at us as being too small a population, and so they don't see the impact on the scale that our communities can actually provide by giving opportunities for those young people to actually build power with the other communities that they're investing to really see that scale.
And so what does a good partnership look like, a positive partnership between Native communities and philanthropy? Have you all had experience with funders that you felt like was a very productive partnership? And if so, what did that partnership look like?
Yeah, sure. I can chime in here briefly. You know, we have a lot of really excellent relationships that with funders that I think really model where, you know, I hope a lot of philanthropy will continue to grow as we hopefully help strengthen investments in tribal communities. One of the biggest is really letting the communities lead in what they need. And, you know, it sounds so basic, but a lot of our projects that we get investments in start right with our youth advisory board. They start with the community and the community needs and the things that Native youth are going to be able to do to improve their communities. So, you know, I think the best kinds of relationships really start not with, you know, some kind of flavor of the month funding strategy, but to really to identify those stakeholders who are those ambassadors for their communities, who can really help translate the kinds of issues that matter to them and what the solutions are that they're really acting on. And I also think one of the other big issues is really having a lot of flexibility. You know, we have a lot of projects on the ground that are being driven by Native youth and the people who support them. But, you know, a lot of things happen at the community level. You know, sometimes, you know, a project's going to have to take longer because they need to add a new kind of community advisory board, or, you know, something changes at the cultural level in the community. And a lot of times the flexibility just isn't there, depending on how different funders' strategies might work. So those are just a couple things.
No, thank you for that. I want to shift to talk a little bit about protective factors. So on page 4 of the report lists 7 protective factors. And maybe, Sarah, you can start with talking about why NAP wanted to lift up this research, for why funders need to understand these protective factors. And maybe Dr. Yellowbird, if you can chime in around what the implications are for this research. You're on mute, Sarah.
Yes, 2.5 years ago when I came to Native Americans in Philanthropy, you know, at that time there were a lot of funding streams that had gotten moving. The Men and Boys and the Women and Girls was just starting up. And in the philanthropy world, you know, how you get to the table is research. And so at that time, I was really noticing that there was a lack of funding for research. And I thought to myself, you know, well, this is horrible. We're so far behind. Like, how do we catch up? These conversations have been moving and moving. And so I began to talk to scholars like Dr. Yellowbird and Dr. Karina Walters and Dr. Rosalie Gonzalez and saying, what can we do? You know, I want us to have the same opportunity as the other ethnic groups are having. How do we design something, you know, for our youth? And at that time, I really wanted Indigenous scholars, because I thought to myself, you know, I knew that we were doing a lot of work around decolonization. I knew that our scholars were doing this work. And then it just occurred to me in that process that, you know, part of the issue was that we have a very different worldview. And our Indigenous worldview really, you know, moves us to think holistically as well as, you know, to problem solve. And then like any other ethnic group, you know, I know that the California Endowment has done a lot of really great work around, you know, protective factors and looking at health statistics. And one of the very first conversations that I had with Dr. Ross was he was saying, yes, you know, identity is the key. And, you know, we see that in our research that when youth find their identity, and I thought, we don't have that information out there for our youth. And so working with Dr. You know, Yellowbird and the other two scholars was something where we were able to work with these really incredible academic leaders that have been working in this area for a really long time to be able to help us catch up. And it's not done. I mean, this was our first sort of pass at a lit review that showed not only Indigenous worldview, but also protective factors like cultural connectedness and family connectedness, spirituality and ceremonies, extended kin bond networks, healthy traditional food, and youth self-efficacy as those protective factors to lift up for philanthropy to begin to understand and to know. And part of the next phase of our work is going to be really drilling into each protective factors to also demonstrate how to fund under these protective factors as we work on a new project with the Foundation Center on a web portal to show case studies and have a knowledge center as well as a funding map. So I'll stop there and let Dr. Yellowbird share his perspective on his work with this research.
So thank you. I think it's really important to note that in different respects, Native people have some really significant genetic differences that are really important to consider in terms of protective factors. And I know that when we were going through these protective factors, we talked about a lot of things like how important mentors were, the connectedness that, you know, youth have with at least 5 or 6 really key people in their life that provide a really protective net around folks. And, you know, as I've been doing more and more research, especially around this particular area, I came across some really interesting findings about collectivist cultures, which Indigenous people are. There's even what's been found in the literature is that there even is a particular gene variant that codes for cooperation and collectivity. So all these people that are still tribal people genetically, that have just been here for a certain period of time, have shared this, what they call a serotonin transporter gene, STG. That's the particular variant. And it's a 5-HTTLRP is how it's identified. And from the research, it shows something really fascinating, is that those people that have that particular gene that are in communities, that are collectively working together, are actually protected from things like suicide, loneliness, other mood disorders, and so on. You know, so being in a collective sort of situation is a huge, powerful protective factor, but not like how we ever imagined it before. But now we have this genetic science. Something really interesting in that too is that same gene, that serotonin transporter gene, also codes for, that variant codes for humor. You ever heard of Indian humor? It's really important. It's the same genetic variant as in the collectivist culture. It's the 5-HTT-LRP gene. So you can Google that and look it up. But that's one of the most important protective factors that youth have, is to be together with people that care about them, but can find humor in a situation. They have a gene variant that actually codes for that. If you can laugh enough, if you can be around people you love and people that love you, you're going to find that you're protected against a lot of different kinds of health disorders and diseases, especially those emotional ones. That's just one of the things that I've been doing more in depth to kind of study this idea of how spirituality and all these other factors are involved, but especially in particular the connectedness. Spirituality is pretty much the same. We know that from the research now that people talk about a God, part of the God brain or the God lobe or whatever, the parietal lobe of the brain. We recognize now that what people did in terms of spiritual ceremonies, contemplative practices, activates particular parts of the brain. And we know that when youth are exposed to those kinds of things that have meaning, spiritual meaning, it activates particular parts of the brain, like the anterior cingulate cortex, which is a protective part of the brain that's around compassion. They see more compassion for their people, more compassion for themselves, which I think is something that happened, that was taken away from them through boarding school experiences and that kind of thing. So I think one of the things that is such an important protective factor is that we need to have knowledge of our genetic inheritance as well as the epigenetic changes that have occurred during the period of colonization and how it's really disrupted the lives of people. So anybody in philanthropy should have an understanding that these groups in many ways are different than other American youth because they have a cultural tradition and especially a cultural genetic evolution along with culture that have sculpted their parents, their grandparents, and them. And those genes we know now are inherited and passed along. So that's really clearly another big piece of their identity, because we used to talk about our identity as in language and our dress and ceremonies, but now we know we have a genetic identity to go along with all these other kinds of things. In another protective factor I just wanted to mention real quickly is that all of these tribes have stories of resilience in their narratives. They've survived all kinds of horrendous things, climate change, smallpox, genocide. And I think that's one of the most powerful protective factors that they can, again, get back to, is that if they are able to build those into their work and to understand, how far their people came, I think that is going to be a very powerful protective factor. So I'll say that much. I've got a lot more to say, but if you have more questions, I can answer them.
That was fascinating. If you want to really be schooled in what protective factors and research impacting Native youth, everyone needs to read Dr. Yellowtail's work. That's amazing. And I think that what you're lifting out for me, Dr. Yellowbird, I think I said Yellowtail, sorry. Dr.
That's
Yellowbird.
my grandfather. It's cool. Yeah.
Is that there is trauma, right, that we carry through generations from our history that our Native young people are carrying, but there also is a resilience and a joy, and so and a lot of that we find through culture as well. And so a lot of times with the philanthropy, we think of language and culture as something that is a thing that art funders might fund, right? And so I think it's really telling when you think of the protective factors that are in your research that we call out in the report, that investing in culture is really a critical way of restoring holistic well-being in Native youth. And so could someone speak a little bit more about that and why it's really important that I think funders understand that to invest in culture is not an arts grant necessarily, but if you're interested in improving education, if you're interested in improving healthcare, well-being, that culture really is a critical piece of that work.
Yeah, Edgar, I can chime in real briefly on that, and I'm really happy that you're putting an emphasis on this. One of the things that we do every year now is a national online survey of Native youth 18 to 24 about the kinds of resources they need for success. And and one of the questions that we ask is, what are the top 3 issues that matter most to you out of everything from education to juvenile justice? Number 1, with about a 3-fold response rate over everything else, is culture and language. And we know that because the reason for those kinds of responses is that every single issue that Native youth are dealing with is related to culture and language. It's the foundation of who we are, and Native youth know that. They're out at the forefront really helping us revitalize our languages and rebuild our traditions. But for a lot of those youth, for instance, urban youth in urban centers who don't have good connection to their culture, that's oftentimes what they cite as the biggest challenges they have. They know that by bringing culture into their lives, by being part of their communities, that they're going to be able to be connected with the kinds of opportunities and resilience that they see everywhere. So when we have issues like suicide prevention or any other issue, Native youth are always leading with culture, and the kinds of innovations that they're developing in their own programming when it comes to culture is really what's going to help bring our communities into a better place. And so one of the things that I just want to really emphasize when it comes to the culture and language piece is that it does oftentimes in philanthropy get sort of put in this corner around arts or something else that's really siloed from who we really are. But I really challenge philanthropy to actually just go and look at what Native youth are doing and see the kinds of programming they're developing and start at that point. Don't start at just the idea of culture and language. Start about the challenges they're tackling and see how culture and language is a protective factor for them in action in their daily lives.
Thank you for that. We are already getting lots of questions in, but before we take your questions, remember, if you have questions, put them in the chat box. We'll try to take as many as we can, and you can also tweet your questions to @SchottFound, and we will work to address those questions. Sarah, I wanted to, before we jump to questions, give you an opportunity to just share a little bit about some opportunities for folks to plug in right now. There are existing opportunities within philanthropy that NAP is leading for funders who want to, jump on board and support Native youth.
Sure, thank you for the opportunity. I guess I would lift up just a few ways on our strategies and then go into our Philanthropy Institute. So a few of our strategies that we work with the community on are public education, educational conferences, and engaging philanthropy. And all of those are so important strategies because, we utilize through public education, social media, various speaking engagements, events, programming where we work to integrate in youth into these different opportunities to be on these shared platforms has been really important. Engaging philanthropy and utilizing advocacy as an opportunity to do that has been really important work that we've been able to share. And one of the things that it just really I think in this day and age of, Black Panther and everybody talking about decolonization, and, I feel like in many ways, America is asking themselves, like, who are we? Who are we now? And it just really, for me, I think to myself, how can we talk about who we are in America when you don't know the basic, historic information about how America was formed? And the Native American narrative in America. And I feel like that, that seems in many ways, because it's been brushed under the rug and because it's sometimes hard to deal with, this fact. But at the same time, we have examples like folks from Canada and the Truth and Reconciliation that happened the decade in Canada. So right now, we're entering into this new campaign at Native Americans in Philanthropy around healing. And that campaign is really about the education and the decolonization work that needs to happen. And I've been in philanthropy, for this few years, 2.5 years. And while I love many of our colleagues, and I can point to so many great examples of where foundations, like Casey Family Programs, went to the Blackfoot Reservation and actually spent time in the community. California Endowment does the same thing. And then you see foundations that will do an educational day. California Endowment really recently asked us to come in and do a 3-hour session with their staff and board because they wanted to catch up and to learn. So those are some great examples, but we have a really great opportunity because our Philanthropy Institute is coming up in June 13th through 15th at the Tamaya Resort outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Beautiful resort. And our idea is to really focus on this theme, the movement of movements, the healing worldview of Indigenous peoples. And this came to us because for us, the movement of movements and what we've been working on for the past 2.5 years, building allies within the communities, people of color communities, we really wanted to name, that the movement of movements needs to include Indigenous peoples in our worldview at the forefront, and how that worldview is a healing worldview. And so I do see many different communities wanting to learn and know, well, this conference is basically your opportunity to learn and know really truly, because we're bringing in our friends from Canada. So we have folks from the Calgary Foundation, as well as our counterpart, the Circle, that will be coming in from Canada to share how they've been funding in around healing strategies and culture and traditions as a way for acknowledgement and healing. And then we have a really great scholar joining us too, Dr. Bonnie Duran from the University of Washington, and she's going to share her work on authentic partnerships. And she's introducing and sharing her partner or evidence-based, community-based participatory research model. So for all of the academics that really love that, we have a scholar coming in to share with you a culturally appropriate way to ally and partner. So again, we have registration open now. You can go to our website, nativephilanthropy.org, and you are invited to come, because this is actually, we're doing our conference in a really different way this time around, where we're really beginning to integrate those cultural practices into the entire conference. So we have folks coming to help youth orgs that are coming, like We Are Native and First Peoples Fund, that, and then we just announced that Taboo from the Black Eyed Peas is also going to come and be with us as well. So I look forward and invite you all to come and be with us at our conference.
Thank you, Sarah. So we're going to transition now for some questions that are coming in from our participants. I'll just kind of go down the list, and whoever feels led to respond, please jump in. One question is asking about if there are any national Native youth leadership convenings where folks can connect with young people. And then kind of related to that, how can Native youth be a part of this larger movement to challenge philanthropy?
Yeah, this is Eric. I definitely recommend for anyone out there who hasn't connected with Unity, United Indian Tribal Youth, to please do. They've been around for a long time, and they are our partners who bring a lot of youth together. So they have an annual conference in the summer, and then a mid-year conference as well. And last year in Denver, I believe they hit about 2,000 for their registration. And so a lot of our partner organizations like We Are Native that Sarah just mentioned, NCAI and others, do a lot of work at the Unity Conference. It's a very youth-driven movement, and Unity really is the backbone that supports tribal councils, tribal youth councils at the school level, at the tribal government level, and that's really their regular gathering. And we really do our best to help build capacity across their programs as well.
Thank you, Eric. Someone is asking, is there a sort of like a national Native Youth Advisory Board of Coalition? It seems a little challenging for each tribe to connect with, 560 plus tribes. So is there one place where there's a coalition that speaks on behalf of, Native youth that folks can connect with?
Yeah, I would. I would say there's a number of different places where you can really engage with youth who've connected their movements together. One big one that a lot of our partner organizations have been a part of since President Obama launched it in 2014 is Generation Indigenous, which was a cross-sector call to action to strengthen resources for Native youth and provide new platforms for them to advocate. Our organization runs the Gen I National Native Youth Network as part of that, where thousands of youth across the country took a Gen I challenge to say what they were doing in their community to create positive change, and then were able to participate in some of the tribal youth gatherings that the White House sponsored over the last couple of years before the administration changed. Since then, we've been doing a lot to partner our youth network along with groups like Native Americans in Philanthropy, who has sponsored some convenings to bring some of those Gen I ambassadors together, as well as Unity and others. And we're really working together to identify as many opportunities as possible to bring together a number of different coalitions who are really trying to bring their priorities together so that they can be shared on new platforms. But I think that, you know, Unity and a number of the others where you see a lot of these youth who are actually wearing multiple hats with our organization, with, you know, NIHB, NCAI, where they're gathering, and to be able to go and sit down with any of their leadership bodies. Unity has a leadership board. We have a youth advisory board. Those are excellent ways to really engage with youth who are participating in a number of different movements, who can really help educate you about the priorities that matter to a lot of youth across the country.
Yeah, and I would jump in and just add that Native Americans in Philanthropy, part of our work with Generation Indigenous is that we do work on the philanthropic side of, you know, providing opportunities for funders to learn as well. So we've held regional convenings. Our first one was at the White House, Obama's White House a couple years ago. And then we went and held another one at Standing Rock during the protest. We've held one in Northern California in partnership with the California Endowment. And so we've move these regional convenings around in order to provide an opportunity for local Native orgs to come and share their work with funders. So that's also one opportunity to plug into to learn about some regional funding opportunities as well. And so through that process, we're gathering grassroots orgs and grassroots folks. And then we developed the Gen I Fund because what we saw was, you know, when Standing Rock was happening, a lot of foundations were just having a hard time connecting with orgs or being able to fund, you know, the really grassroots work. So the fund that we do with the Minneapolis Foundation, the Gen Indigenous Fund, is really focused on supporting those grassroots groups as they begin to kind of emerge in this moment as well. So that's a little bit of what we're doing on our end. Thank you.
And I want to just say for folks who are looking to connect with Native groups, Native youth, of course, any of us on this call, you can reach out to us. In the back of the report that we're referencing and talking about today that you can download from our website, we do list the participants. These are not Native youth necessarily, but these are a lot of organizations like the American Indian College Fund and Unity that we've talked about here who are working with Native youth. So these are also great resources. And then I want to reiterate Native Voices Rising, which Sarah talked about a little bit. We heard in Philanthropy years ago that we would love to fund Native advocacy groups, but we don't know who they are, or we don't know that they exist. And so that work, Native Voices Rising, which you can find information about on NAP's website, the first phase of that was actually to do a survey of organizations and to provide a list of organizations, Native-led organizations that were doing advocacy work. So we know tons of organizations. And so what I always say is that whatever your foundation is interested in, whatever your passion and whatever the mission is of your foundation, there are Native people and Native organizations doing that work. And we're happy to try to make those connections for you. One last question, or maybe second to last, depending on how long we take to answer this one. So we've been talking a little bit about movements. And so there's a question around how do we bridge and connect these movements that are happening? And so with Native organizing and Native-led work that's happening on the ground, where does that work connect to or overlap with sort of the Dreamers, Black Lives Matter, work that we're seeing? Eric, you mentioned earlier, the march around gun control. Are Native youth involved in these movements, or are they connected to other movements led by youth of color? How does that show up?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question, because that's actually one of the things that we hear a lot from our youth advisory board and a lot of our other Gen I ambassadors and any number of Native youth leaders in our network. They are working on all the big issues that you see on TV every day, but too often they don't have seats at those tables, and they're not built into broader social justice movements in the way that they should be. And Native youth know they have a lot of power in their voice for those broader movements, whether it's women's rights, lands and waterways. You can name any of them right now. The gun control movement, we've been having a lot of discussions around that. So one of the things that we're doing actually this month is we're going to be launching a new fellowship to identify a small cohort of Gen I ambassadors from across the country who are going to be able to connect with those broader social justice movements. So we'll be giving them some high-level leadership development opportunities and really helping them sit down in seminar-like discussions with leaders of those different movements to really have a thorough discussion about, how can Native youth be better built into some of these movements, and what can we do to go back to our communities and coalitions that we're working with on the ground in tribal communities to bring more Native youth to the table so that those movements are just more powerful. So I think it's a big issue, and I really do challenge anyone working in those spaces to really try to think about that. When Native youth aren't at the table, when you're having a big coalition meeting about a major issue that matters to our communities, reach out to any of us and ask how you can build more Native youth voice into those conversations. It's really critical.
I'd like to say something on that too as well. I think it's really important, no matter where it's happening at in the United States, any place in the Western Hemisphere for that matter. The U.S. has been very slow to recognize that it is a settler colonial state. Australia has recognized that, New Zealand's recognized that, Canada's recognized that, and other places that I've gone. There should be a Native person opening up every one of those meetings. It doesn't matter if they're, what just happened in Florida, or these youth are talking. Everybody should be acknowledging that they're still on Indigenous people's land. It doesn't matter whether they're dreamers or whoever they are, unless they're Indigenous people, they're settlers here. So youth have to be trained in order to assert themselves, to get that microphone and say, welcome to our country, or something. This is important, that they have to, something that Sarah was saying earlier, they have to contextualize this whole situation. Because I've been in all these other countries, and the political leaders recognize that they're on Indigenous people's territory. That's something that all these youth leaders across the country, all these other groups, whoever they are, if they're not Indigenous, don't acknowledge that history of Indigenous people. So Indigenous people need to be trained, these young people need to be trained to walk up there, grab that mic, and talk about whose territory they're on. I think that's very, very important. That can set the stage for inclusion. Otherwise, if you, this is just my opinion based upon a lot of history in the back, if you beg and put us on the stage or whatever it is, you're going to be left off, right? You have to go up, you have to remember, they have to remember this is their country, and they have to go up and they have to speak like it is their country.
Thank you for that, Dr. Yellowbird. And I'll just say I've been to 101 conferences in philanthropy where we invite Natives to the stage for a cultural performance and a welcoming, and we appreciate that at some level, but beyond sort of that, token and small moment of appreciating our culture, we're asking for you to partner with us in the long term to invest in our communities. I'm going to try to squeeze in one more for you, Dr. Yellowbird, that came in. A question around what is the greatest need for quantitative research on Native youth right now?
Well, I think, something that precedes quantitative youth is there needs to be a qualitative experience by research. And it's one of the things that I've done is in my research is that you go out and actually talk to people about their situation. They actually get a chance to kind of tell you whether or not, maybe quantitative research is merited. We don't know a lot of these evidence-based practices that are used. And I was trained as a quantitative researcher for years, and I don't always start out with quantitative research. I always start out with a qualitative question like, does this work for you? Does this make any difference? And that's what I started out when I was doing mindfulness with Indigenous youth. I had no idea whether or not it would make any sense to them. So I went out, talked with them, they did it, and they talked about their experience. And so in order to build a really good, reliable, quantitative research plan, we have to understand who these people are and how we begin to understand what the parameters are about these populations, because there are so many things that can be that can interfere, that can be problematic for the research design. I mean, you can't go in and interview people the same way, Native youth, as you can other youth in many contexts, because it may be that, depending upon what tribe there are, there may be many different kinds of parameters where they may or may not feel comfortable speaking, and that could be misread. So that there's a big literature on that happens. But the quantitative stuff comes from the funders as well as the federal government. They're asking for quantitative research, and we've got to be able to provide that. My other flip side says, people have been doing these things, the evidence base of indigenous ceremony, indigenous language, all those methods of helping, are tens of thousands of years old, and so we're using a Western way of thinking about that, in terms of capturing like what's, statistically significant or what makes sense in terms of something that's evidence-based. But again, most of the things we know is that, research is now catching up to a lot of the different tribal traditions and practices and rituals that people had, and people are kind of reinventing this stuff. The paleo diet, for example, a lot of the mindfulness stuff that's going around. Indigenous people had mindful contemplative practices long before they were brought here, but people are still looking at those and wondering whether or not they're effective, and they're doing all this quantitative research. So it kind of works both ways, I guess, so that that it's really important to understand the community. People have to go into these communities and talk with communities. They should go through tribal IRBs as well as their university IRBs to kind of really understand what they're going to do with this quantitative research too as well. So,
absolutely. Well, thank you. We are closing out on time, so I hate that we have to end because this is such an interesting conversation. A couple of things just in closing here for folks who want to keep the conversation going. Again, please check out our report that's available for download on our website, original instructions. And what you'll see here are some very easy tips for funders to begin to engage with Native communities and support Native youth. It's as easy as just making your first grant if you want to learn, and know that all of us here are resources for you to help you navigate if you need that. I want to thank our speakers today. We're so honored to have, Sarah, the CEO of Native Americans for Philanthropy here, Eric from the Center for Native American Youth, and Dr. Michael Yellowbird from North Dakota State University. I really appreciate you all taking time today and sharing your expertise. To continue the conversation, we invite you to join Schott's National Opportunity to Learn Network. It's at our website at schottfoundation.org. To follow us on Twitter. We also invite you to follow the organizations that we highlighted today and the work of Dr. Michael Yellowbird there. If you're not a member of NAP and you're a funder, you should join NAP. It's very easy. And again, I want to also invite you to our National Philanthropy Institute happening in June. It'll be a wonderful time to learn more about communities and to actually engage with community there directly in New Mexico. So that's a great opportunity to continue learning. And then finally, I want to say that I have a new book coming out in October called Decolonizing Wealth, which touches on all of these subjects. And it really is a call to philanthropy and to those working in social finance and institutions that are move and control money, and identifying the colonial dynamics that exist in these institutions, and offering a different way, and touching on the subjects that Sarah and others mentioned here today around healing, and the work that is needed to decolonize our work that we're doing in philanthropy. So we invite you to pre-order that book on Amazon.com, and all the proceeds from that book will be going to support Native youth. That being said, we hope to see you guys at the conference in June. And thank you for your participation today, and for being with us and doing our best to support our young people. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.